G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope that you are super well. Today we're shooting on the Z6 III with the 50mm 1.2. I've got the beautiful halo light at 1% illuminating me here. This video is about Sony's semiconductor division and the talk in the industry that Sony might actually sell off that unit. Also, later in this episode, we will talk about, is Canon starting to use Sony sensors? Have Sony accidentally shared with us something that's coming soon from Canon, or is this just simply an innocent mistake? More of this later in this episode. Interestingly, Sony, if we do some research, seems to hold around about 50% of the market. It has changed. It was higher, it has been lower. They had hoped it to be 60% of the market in 2025. They won't achieve their goals, and that is due to competition. The next closest supplier is Samsung, who probably hold around 19 to 20% of the market, and then there are other suppliers below that. The semiconductor division, which includes sensors, and it's sensors in all sorts of devices. It might include, for example, the DJI Pocket or the Panasonic Lumix cameras, of course, Sony 35mm cameras, and so many more products. We simply don't know all the places that Sony sensors are in. Interestingly, Tim Cook, a couple of years ago, admitting the fact that Apple and Sony had a relationship for over a decade, supplying sensors for Apple. Now, in that post from Tim Cook, they talked about the use of Sony sensors in iPhones. And if we think about modern phones, they will actually have something like 5 sensors in them, 3 on the back and 2 on the front, 1 for face recognition and an actual camera. 5 sensors per device. What they didn't talk about was iPads, laptops, and iMacs, and all of the various devices that Apple use, which might include sensors. The number of sensors that might come from Sony into Apple devices could exceed 1 billion sensors a year. If we do research online, it looks like Apple makes up something like 40 to 50% of Sony's small or mobile sensor sales. Now, of course, sensors that are used in smaller devices than, say, our interchangeable lens cameras makes up by far, absolutely by far, the lion's share of the market. Sensors that we find in our interchangeable lens cameras, if you were to look at a pie chart, they don't even make up 1% of that pie. If Apple was to take their business from Sony and give it to Samsung, as is suggested, perhaps as soon as 2026, this would be a huge change for Sony. And thus, that is why we believe there's talk and speculation that Sony might be planning to sell off their semiconductor division. It doesn't make as much profit as it used to be. It used to sit at something like 25%, and now it's more like 10%. Some of this is due to competition, and some of this is due to the enormous R&D costs of creating ever more powerful sensors. This includes stack sensors and have more of the AI implementation. This is costing Sony a lot. There is concerns, because it's not as profitable, that Sony might simply want to move it on and then be able to focus more on their entertainment and, say, their PS divisions. It's also believed, due to the lower valued yen, that has protected the sensor division from some of the rising costs that they are facing. So due to all of this, Sony may well offload their sensor division so they can focus on their more profitable areas. Is this a big deal? Well, not really. I suppose the reason that I talk about it is mostly in the context of this channel, because Sony cameras and Sony's sensor division, they're all Sony. Other companies that use Sony sensors are somehow under Sony camera division's thumb, which is simply not the case. I've read so many accounts and heard from so many different people how these companies actually work. It's simply not true. And if Sony does end up selling this division, well, Sony Cameras is going to be in the same position as everybody else. They already were, but now those who kept trying to let us know that there was some sort of hold over the rest of the industry, well, they definitely won't be able to cite that anymore. Along with that, we know, for example, Red make their own sensors, and we have no idea where they come from. They don't get their sensors from Sony. They have been able to create in the V-Raptor a global 8K sensor which has enormous dynamic range. It is very different to the A9 III sensor, which is global and only 24 megapixels, allowing for 4K video. Even so, it could potentially do 6K. Sony have only gone to 4K, doesn't have as good dynamic range, and an ISO that starts at 250. It's just a completely different beast. And of course, we know that Canon completely fabricate their own sensors in-house, and of course, they are still equal up there at the top of the market. When we look at overall sales, Canon is up there with Sony. So it's a very interesting landscape. And speaking of Canon, there's something very interesting. So I was recently reading the financial report from Sony Semiconductor Sensor Division. And interestingly, and I don't really understand why this is, but they're talking about creating sensors for the industry. It includes an image of the DJI Pocket 3, along with an image of a rather somewhat photoshopped Canon 5D. Now, this is intriguing to me that the people that put together this PDF would show when there were 4 images in this cluster. Another one is of a Sony camera, one is of a DJI camera, and we're all confident that DJI do use Sony sensors.
And we know for a fact that Apple iPhones use Sony sensors because Tim Cook told us just a couple of years ago.
But why is there a somewhat photoshopped Canon camera, a 5D, in this selection of images? And they're talking about future sensor creation. Could this possibly be some form of cryptic hint that Canon might be thinking or starting to use some of Sony's semiconductor sensors? Is this possible? Or is this just simply a graphic designer who went to an image library and didn't even bother to check what camera this is? I don't know, but it's very strange to me to see a Canon camera in a Sony annual report when we know for a fact that Canon make their own sensors. At the end of the day, it doesn't really change our worlds too much, other than, I would say, the echo chamber that we've all had to listen to. But business is tough, and if Apple do pull their business from Sony over the next few years, and the industry states, if it does happen, it will be gradual. It won't be all of the business at once, but if they do take their business from Sony, and they do, as is speculated, bring their sensor design in-house, and the manufacturing could go to anyone. It could go to the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, the TSMC, who of course makes the M1, M2, M3, M4 processors. They left Intel behind. They're now also leaving behind the company that makes their communication chips. They're going to be doing that themselves. And thus Apple, who is always in the pursuit of trying to make their product better than everybody else and has the trillions of dollars to actually do this, they have way more money than Sony do, then yes, if there's any company placed to make some of the best sensor technology we've ever seen, it's Apple. They've done it with their processors, they're doing it with their communications chips. It makes perfect sense to do it with their sensors. So what do you think, everybody? Will Sony sell their sensor division? And if they do, will it change anything? Will it potentially make them more competitive, or could it make things more expensive? Perhaps they'll wait until Apple has finally moved on, because that is where the big money is. We are talking about hundreds of millions of sensors going to Apple every year. When that business dries up, well, maybe the fun times are over. All right, everybody. Well, as usual, it's been so good to see you. And if this is your first time here, I would love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right. Bye for now.